Hey everyone, today we're going to be taking a look at this really interesting paper that pretty much made an artificial V1 as part of the visual cortex to improve convolutional neural networks. And so one of the main things that this paper looked at was this sort of problem that common convolutional neural networks have. Basically, the way that we kind of train these networks is in a way that if we have some really small perturbation in the data, so we add this sort of random noise essentially, to the data, it'll really confuse our model. And even though, and obviously, a human looking at both of these images would, have a hard time even differentiating that they're at all. But the model, can't even tell it that it's still a cat, and can't even tell really that they're, almost identical to the same picture. And so this is sort of one of the motivations behind this paper is identifying and actually showing that actually the main motivation was making the VOneBlock, was modeling it after the visual cortex. And they showed that, as they studied it, it turns out that this actually makes it helpful or robust. So we'll actually see how they do that here. And so this is not new, and a lot of papers have kind of looked at sort of the VOneBlocks, or essentially the idea behind how to create neural networks, and from even what a neural network is, like the multi-layer perceptron, is kind of inspired by these neurons, obviously, and also these convolutional networks are inspired. So they have this sort of hierarchical structure, and so when the brain looks at something, what happens is whatever the image is, it would go through the optic nerve back to the visual V1, and then you would hierarchically go up, and you would also, what would happen is you expand the receptive field as you go through these layers. So as you're going through these layers, you're seeing larger and larger portions of the original image. And this is actually pretty much identical, or at least the basis of how these convolutional networks, and at least maybe it's convergent that they were designed that way, or just happens to work out, be a really good system, and that's just kind of how would be a really good way to do it. But either way, it's just the same sort of hierarchical convolutional approach that as we go through, and our network will look at larger and larger pieces of the original image at once. And so what has been done, though, research is the sort of convolutional neural networks that we've seen, and a lot of them that are trained on, are kind of not really constrained, and they're kind of very, they're not really, other than the sort of bare bones biologically inspired structure, they're very, they're still, kind of different, distinct. And so there's been people that have done, how can we actually, what are actual filters that we can use in convolution that actually more closely mimic the V1 layer? And this is essentially what the Gabor filter at least tries to do. So the Gabor filter is essentially just a convolution of, we see on the left-hand side here, this is a Gaussian part, and then we also have a Fourier transform. And the essential idea here is that we're analyzing frequency, and the image on the basis of this frequency domain. And so this is essentially the main paper, and I think it's actually really simple. The whole idea of this paper is they essentially replaced the first convolutional block. They expanded the number of channels, which is actually kind of important, so I might as well talk about that now. But basically in usual CNNs, they have more filters on the back, and that's, you see that these are longer. That's because you can usually get more global information, and so usually this research is kind of focused on expanding layers of filters, so it's kind of interesting that here they're actually expanding the number of channels in front and showing that actually helps robustness. So, and I think it's kind of important because a lot of these models have been judged on basically absolute performance, on if you got this image right or wrong, and based on these static data sets. But understanding things, how sensitive are models to actually image classification, things like that might actually get lost. With this very absolute sort of minded approach of what is the best accuracy, and that would be the best model. And so this is, I think, a very interesting paper that looks at, how to actually create, or how these networks that are modeled after the V1 cortex, you put them just like in the V1 cortex, you put it it's like the first layer that goes through, you put it as the first layer that goes through in this neural block. And so the V1 neurons in the V1 block have these sort of two simple approaches. They have a simple and a complex approach, which is all sort of biologically inspired. And actually, so this is from the paper, one of the papers that they cited. This was a paper that actually looked at the neurons in a rhesus macaque, V1, in their receptive field, and actually identified the same structure. So this is the sort of LNP, their generalized LNP model, linear Poisson model. And basically, what happens is that there's two different kinds of cells here that have nonlinear combinations. The first is kind of similar more to a regular network, but the second one also has a filter where it gets like crossed in a way. I'll see a little bit more about that in a second. But basically, you're representing in a certain way that, and then all this is nonlinear. The transform, so you're essentially constraining your filter in order to look at the image a certain way. And this is what they say that how the rhesus macaque actually looks at these images, and that they use essentially the same approach to actually identify this V1 layer. And I think that they had just, again, sort of looked at the absolute accuracy. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But just going a little bit more into how they actually made these Gabor filters and how they actually were able to optimize them with constraints that they actually found from literature. So this is, I think, the coolest part of this paper, is basically they found, so this is the sort of big nasty formula for the Gabor filter that they were using as part of their convolutional block. But basically they pulled these sort of references that showed that things like orientation tuning, so basically, in the fovea where your eye looks at things, you have a certain number of filters that go vertically, and you have more of the filters that go vertically than the ones that go horizontally. And at least there's a difference between those. And notice that the foveal segments are more turned. I'm sorry, I actually said that the opposite. But this paper, if you look at this graph, and this is the paper that they actually use, that they gather this constraint from, so there's more turned to this horizontal or vertical than this oblique side, than the side-to-side side. So basically, they actually use these numbers to identify out of how many cells, how many of these convolutional filters that they have are constrained in a certain way, and they can show that this is just the theta parameter in this transformation here, and the same sort of thing. This peak spatial frequency, so not all of them basically fire at the same time and have the same frequency, and then there's also sort of this joint distribution on the complex parts that they model here. And this will all has the effect of saying, well, they looked at the V1, all of these studies were based on the V1 and these rhesus macaques, and they identified, and a lot of people have thought these Gabor filters would be more similar to the way the visual cortex works. And this is, again, one of the benefits, and I think, I'll come back to that in a second, but basically they say that it was not designed to improve this robustness. Like, they made this paper, they just wanted to try to make this V1 and see what would happen, and then they identify that this very important problem, these adversarial attacks, basically what happens when you have small image corruptions, and that this V1 putting these extra layers and putting them and having these biologically inspired constraints at the beginning of your network actually help them with this very specific task. And I think this is just a really interesting paper, because basically it's kind of going more into detail on something that is obviously a very important metric, is sensitivity to perturbations in your image classifier, but it's not as optimized. Like we don't optimize for that. We optimize for absolute accuracy. So things like that might actually fall through the cracks, and a lot of the conventions might have to be a little questioned. We can see actually the benefit of having these bigger layers at the front of your network versus the back of your network for something like robustness. And so they do actually do this very interesting adversarial training approach, which I'll just briefly talk about. But these are basically two different ways of saying, using this loss function, they want to minimize the loss like you would in any other network, but they also are maximizing the error, this error that they can give to the network. So they want to simultaneously minimize the loss while maximizing the amount of error that they would get out of that. So that's a way that they would actually make this robust to perturbations here. And so like this is just the results from their models, and basically when they have very strong differences in their images, very strong distortions, their model does a lot better than the previous model. So that's a very interesting part of it, and this is kind of state of the art. So this is also a task, adversarial training. So people have been interested in doing this, and it seems like this way has kind of beats the state of the art for a lot of these other adversarial attacks, and understanding images, that are just modified in some way that a human could look at that and say that they're not really different, but a machine might have a little bit more trouble. And so, yeah, they essentially say it just like this, and they bold this, so this is why I kind of quoted this. They essentially say V1 nets improve the robustness to all adversarial attacks tested in many common image corruptions, and they accomplish this with no additional training overhead. And so I thought this was really interesting. The one thing I did was kind of interesting, so I was curious to see, basically they did constrain their networks with all these biologically inspired, pretty much numbers that they gathered from these other people. And I wonder if there's ways to actually, have the network detect that itself, maybe make this more generalizable, so you can make it like what I'm trying to say, I guess, more of a structural sort of way to train it, as opposed to relying on other information. But I do think it's very interesting, and I do think it might help a lot, especially in making image classifiers more robust to other perturbations. So thanks a lot for watching. Appreciate it.